The wagon rattled into the dusty yard, and Ezra Sloane's heart pounded with hope and dread. He had dreamed for months of a gentle bride, small and delicate, who might fill the silence of his lonely ranch with soft words. But when the dust cleared, the woman who stepped down was nearly twice his size, with broad shoulders, steady eyes, and hands built for plows instead of teacups. Neighbors gasped, children pointed, and Ezra's face burned. This was not the life he imagined, yet it was the beginning of one he could never have planned. Follow my story to the end, and comment the city you are watching from, so I can see just how far this tale travels. The wagon came to a stop in front of Ezra Sloane's ranch, its wheels groaning under the weight of trunks and time. The sun beat down on the valley, baking the dust until it shimmered in the air. Ezra adjusted his vest and tried not to tug at the collar of his shirt. He wanted to look presentable, dignified, even though his palms were damp with sweat. Months of anticipation had led to this moment. Today, the woman who had written him letters, filled with warmth and promise, would finally arrive. He had imagined her 100 ways, small, delicate, her voice gentle, her hands tender. Someone who would soften the hard edges of his solitude. But as the wagon door creaked open and a figure stepped down, the ground seemed to tilt beneath him. She was taller than any man in the gathering crowd, 6 feet at least in her scuffed boots. Her shoulders were broad, her hands calloused, her presence commanding. Ezra craned his neck to meet her gaze, his mouth suddenly dry. The letters had spoken of loneliness, of wanting companionship, of cozy meals shared at lamplight. Never once had they mentioned that Clara Blaine was built like a storm given human form. The neighbors who had gathered for spectacle whispered sharply. Mrs. Henderson from the general store leaned toward her husband, hiding a smirk behind her hand. Little Tommy Morrison pointed outright before his mother yanked his arm down. Ezra's ears burned with embarrassment. This was supposed to be private, intimate. Instead, it felt like the whole town had come to laugh at him. Fletcher Knox, the merchant who had arranged the meeting, scrambled down from the wagon seat, his eyes darting nervously between Ezra and Clara. "Well," he said, forcing a cheerfulness, "he didn't feel here we are." Clara herself stood awkwardly, her confidence faltering for the first time as she looked at Ezra's slight frame. She had likely imagined someone different too. For a moment, the two of them stared, caught in a silence that stretched painfully across the dusty yard. Ezra swallowed hard, forcing himself to step forward. He extended a trembling hand. "Ezra Sloane," he said, his voice cracking, despite his effort to sound steady. Clara's hand engulfed his when she offered hers. Her grip was firm but careful, as though she knew the risk of crushing him by accident. "Clara Blaine," she replied. Her voice was deeper than Ezra expected, steady, rich, and not unkind. The crowd leaned closer, listening as though the smallest exchange between them were part of a theater performance. Ezra wanted to melt into the earth. "We should talk," Clara said, her tone making it clear she was wrestling with the same doubts racing through Ezra's mind. Fletcher Knox, eager to escape the tension, busied himself with unloading her trunk from the wagon. It was larger than Ezra expected, nearly as broad as the trunk of a young oak tree, and it only reinforced the sense that nothing about this day would match his carefully constructed dreams. Ezra's heart twisted painfully as Clara turned her gaze toward the ranch. He braced for a wrinkle of the nose, a sign of disappointment in the weathered cabin, the patched corral fence, the modest spread he called home. Instead, she nodded at the neat rows of his vegetable garden, at the stacked firewood by the porch. Approval flickered across her features, Grace, despite the strangeness of the moment. Ezra's chest tightened. He hadn't expected kindness, not from someone who looked as though she could break a wild horse in two. The crowd eventually dispersed, but whispers lingered in the air long after Boots shuffled back toward town. Ezra and Clara were left standing at the edge of the porch, the silence between them thick and uncomfortable. Ezra cleared his throat. "It's not much," he said, gesturing at the ranch. Clara tilted her head, her eyes steady. "It's honest," she answered simply. The word landed heavier than Ezra anticipated. Honest. The ranch was modest, patched together with sweat and long nights, but it was his. For a moment he dared to hope that maybe she saw more than what met the eye. But as the sun dipped lower and the long shadows stretched across the valley, Ezra couldn't shake the stares, the whispers, the sting of disappointment that clung to him like dust. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. This wasn't the gentle dream he had written letters about. And yet something about Clara's quiet nod at his garden, the careful grip of her large hand lingered in his mind. The day had begun with hope and collapsed into shock, but Ezra couldn't know yet this was only the beginning of a story neither of them could have imagined. That night, Ezra couldn't sleep. The cicadas hummed outside his window, but the sound only made the silence inside his cabin sharper. He lay on his back, staring at the rafters, turning over the same thought. What have I done? 3 months ago, by lamplight, he had written his advertisement in the territorial newspaper. His hand had trembled as he scrawled the words, "Honest rancher seeks gentle companion for frontier life. Must appreciate simple pleasures and quiet evenings." He had sealed it with wax, walked to the post office with his boots heavy in the mud, and wondered if anyone would answer. When Clara's letter came written in a careful hand, he had read it until the ink blurred. Her words were filled with loneliness that matched his own. She spoke of wanting warmth, of longing for conversation that meant something, of evenings where silence didn't feel like a weight pressing on the chest. Ezra felt for the first time in years that someone understood. Now, with her trunk in his spare room and her presence filling the cabin like a storm cloud. Those words seemed like a memory he had dreamed. He turned on his side, closed his eyes, but all he saw was Clara stepping down from the wagon, towering, broad-shouldered, her eyes flickering with surprise when she looked at him. At dawn, Ezra rose early as he always did. He stepped outside expecting to be alone, but Clara was already there, standing by the corral, her hair loose in the morning light. She turned at his footsteps, offering the faintest smile. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. Her smile faded. "Not much." Ezra shifted awkwardly, his hands shoved into his pockets. "It's a long journey. Takes time to settle." Clara didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned on the fence rail, studying the horses as though searching for answers in their steady breaths. "I didn't expect—" She stopped herself, jaw tightening. Ezra's stomach knotted. He knew what she meant. She hadn't expected him, his thin frame, his uncertain voice, his ranch patched together with sweat instead of prosperity. He opened his mouth to say something to defend himself, but no words came. Clara finally turned, her eyes soft but steady. "Your letters were honest," she said. "That's why I came." Loneliness looks the same, no matter the size of the hands writing about it. Ezra blinked, caught off guard. "You mean you're not disappointed?" She gave a small laugh, though it held no humor. "I've lived with disappointment a long time, Mr. Sloan. Coming here wasn't about finding someone who fit an image. It was about finding someone who wanted more than silence." Ezra stared at her, unsure how to respond. He felt the weight of her words heavier than her broad shoulders. She hadn't come seeking a fragile dream any more than he had. She'd come because she wanted someone to share the burden of solitude. Before he could gather himself to reply, a commotion split the morning. A shout carried across the valley, sharp and furious. Ezra's heart lurched. "That's Mrs. Henderson," he said, recognizing the shrill edge in her voice. He jogged toward the sound, Clara's long strides falling easily in step beside him. When they crested the rise, Ezra's blood ran cold. His prized bull Samson stood in the middle of Mrs. Henderson's carefully cultivated garden. The animal pawed at the dirt, trampling roses that had taken years to grow, crushing border stones as though they were toys. Mrs. Henderson screamed from her porch, her fists raised in the air, her face red with rage. Two men from the neighboring homestead waved ropes nervously, trying to approach from the front. Samson lowered his massive head horns, glinting in the sun, and charged. The men scrambled back over the fence, barely escaping as the bull plowed through the flower beds. Ezra's stomach twisted with shame. He gripped the fence rail until his knuckles turned white. Samson was nearly 2,000 pounds of stubborn flesh and fury. Ezra had never been strong enough to manage him alone, and now the whole town would see it. "You can't rope him from here," Clara said calmly beside him. Ezra turned, startled. She was watching the bull with a steady gaze, her voice even. "And if those men keep trying from the front, they'll get themselves killed." Ezra swallowed hard, his throat dry. He's always been stubborn, but never like this. I don't know what's gotten into him. The truth was, he had dreaded this day since he bought the animal. He wasn't built to wrestle a creature like Samson, and the neighbors knew it. Their eyes already burned into his back, full of judgment. Then Clara stepped off the fence rail. Her stride was purposeful, her jaw set. Ezra's heart leapt. "Clara, wait." You can't. He's dangerous when he's riled like this. But she was already halfway across the field, her tall frame cutting through the morning light. Ezra's legs carried him after her shorter steps, scrambling to keep up, but he knew he couldn't stop her. And as Samson swung his massive head toward her nostrils flaring, Ezra's chest tightened in terror. The neighbors gasped. Mrs. Henderson fell silent, and the valley seemed to hold its breath. Clara Blaine was walking straight into the path of death. Clara moved with a steadiness that didn't match the chaos around her. Samson's hooves churned up dirt and broken rose bushes, but her steps were measured deliberate, as though she had walked this ground 100 times before. Ezra's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to yell to drag her back to protect her from the sheer madness of approaching a 2,000-pound bull. Yet something in her posture stopped him. The crowd gathered on Mrs. Henderson's porch went silent, their fear mixing with curiosity. Even the children who had been giggling moments earlier stood frozen wide-eyed. Everyone had seen men try to tame Samson before, and everyone had seen those men sent flying into fences for their trouble. But Clara wasn't carrying a rope, a whip, or even a stick, just her voice and her presence. Samson swung his massive head toward her eyes, wild breath snorting like steam from a locomotive. His horns gleamed sharp as sin. Ezra felt his knees weaken. He had raised that bull from a calf, but right now even he didn't recognize the animal. It was as if Samson had turned into a storm made flesh, and Clara was walking directly into its heart. She began to speak, not loud, not commanding, but low and steady like water running over river stones. Easy now, she murmured her words, carrying just far enough for Ezra to hear. You're not angry, are you? Just confused, just far from where you belong. Samson's ears twitched. His pawing slowed. The crowd leaned forward, hardly daring to breathe. Ezra's pulse thundered in his ears. She's mad, someone whispered. That bull will gut her. But Clara didn't falter. She kept her hands open and visible palms facing upward, as though offering trust to the beast. She took one step, then another, closing the distance. 10 feet now. The bull's chest heaved. Another step, 8 feet. Ezra's heart slammed against his ribs. If Samson charged, there'd be no escape. Ezra croaked, his voice cracking under the strain. Please don't. She didn't look back. Her focus was locked on Samson. Then it happened. The bull's head lowered, not in threat, but in something else, weariness, recognition. A sound escaped him that was almost like a sigh. Clara stretched out her hand slowly, carefully, until her palm brushed the thick hide behind his ear. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Henderson's jaw dropped open. Samson didn't charge. He leaned into her touch. Ezra's knees buckled, relief and disbelief flooding him at once. Clara began scratching gently behind the bull's ear, her movements sure practiced. The massive beast shifted his weight, his posture softening until he looked more like an oversized hound than the terror that had moments ago sent grown men scrambling for their lives. Someone fetch me a rope! Clara called, her voice still calm, but carrying the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed. Fletcher Knox sprinted to Ezra's barn and returned moments later with a length of sturdy rope. Clara fashioned a halter with swift, smooth motions, her hands moving as though she had done it 100 times before. Ezra could only watch his mouth dry as Clara looped the halter around Samson's head and gave the rope a gentle tug. To everyone's astonishment, the bull followed her out of the ruined garden, docile as a lamb. The neighbors parted in silence as Clara led the animal across the field. No one dared speak. No one dared laugh. When she finally returned to the fence, Samson trailing obediently behind her, Clara handed Ezra the rope. Their eyes met, and she gave him the smallest smile, soft, almost shy. Your fence has a weak post on the north corner, she said casually, as if taming a rampaging bull was just another chore. We should fix it before he decides to take another stroll. Ezra's mouth opened, but no words came. All he could do was nod. Behind them, Mrs. Henderson sputtered, her anger drowned out by sheer disbelief. Well, I never... She turned back to her trampled roses, muttering, but her fury had lost its teeth. The crowd began to murmur, voices rising with awe rather than ridicule. By the time Ezra and Clara walked back toward the cabin, whispers had already taken root. She calmed him like it was nothing. Never seen the likes of it in my life. Maybe she's exactly what Sloane needed. Ezra's cheeks flushed, not with shame this time, but with something more complicated. Pride battled with humiliation, awe, mixed with unease. Clara Blaine had done what he could not, and now the whole valley knew it. As the sun climbed higher, neighbors drifted back toward town, but the whispers trailed behind them like smoke. And Ezra knew deep down that this day would not be forgotten. Clara's arrival had been a spectacle, but her feat with Samson had turned her into something else entirely. A woman who defied every expectation, every unspoken rule. And for Ezra, that truth was as terrifying as it was undeniable. The news of what Clara Blaine had done spread through the valley before noon. By the time Ezra led Samson back into the corral and latched the gate, folks were already whispering about it in the general store at the blacksmith's forge, even in the pews of the tiny church at the edge of town. Ezra felt the shift immediately. He couldn't walk across his own yard without sensing the eyes of neighbors peering from a distance. They no longer looked at him with pity for being a loner or disdain for being small. No, their curiosity had sharpened. They wanted to know more about the towering woman who had walked into danger and made a raging bull bow like a trained hound. Back at the ranch, Ezra pulled his hat lower over his brow, ashamed of the mess Samson had made. The north fence post leaned at a drunken angle, snapped clean at the base. Clara stood beside it, sleeves rolled up, her long hair tied back. Her expression focused. She ran her palm over the broken wood, studying it as if it were a puzzle. "Too much weight on one post," she said quietly. "You need another cross brace here. Otherwise he'll find his way through again." Ezra rubbed the back of his neck. "I meant to fix it last month. Just never got around to it." Her eyes flicked to him, not unkind but steady. "Then we'll do it today." The word we made his throat tighten. He hadn't worked with anyone in years. His solitude had become as much a habit as breathing. And now here she was speaking like she belonged in his rhythm. Fletcher Knox, still lingering nervously with the empty wagon, cleared his throat. "Well, Ezra, looks like you've got yourself a fine hand here." He tried to sound light, but there was unease behind his words. "I'll be on my way. Folks will be wanting to hear about this." Ezra wanted to tell him to keep his mouth shut, to stop feeding the fire of gossip, but he knew it was pointless. Word was already running faster than Fletcher's horses could pull him. As the merchant rode off, Clara bent to lift one of the spare fence posts from Ezra's small pile of lumber. The sight nearly made him wince. She hoisted it onto her shoulder as though it were no heavier than a broom handle. Ezra hurried to follow, grabbing a hammer and nails, feeling smaller with each step. They worked in silence for a while. Clara drove the post into the ground with strong, rhythmic blows of the sledge, each swing echoing through the valley. Ezra stretched the wire taut, his hands trembling slightly as he fastened it. Every now and then Clara would glance at him, her expression unreadable. "You've done good work here," she said, finally nodding toward the rest of the corral. "Neat, sturdy. You take care with things." Ezra blinked, caught off guard. Compliments were rare in his world. I try," he murmured. Clara leaned on the sledgehammer, her shoulders glistening with sweat. "That's more than most men do. Strength only gets you so far. Care goes the rest of the way." Ezra's heart stumbled at her words. He wanted to believe them, wanted to believe that his careful, methodical way of doing things mattered, but all he could think of was the image of her walking up to Samson while he stood frozen helpless. By late afternoon, the fence was patched. Ezra's hands ached, but Clara didn't seem the least bit tired. As they walked back toward the cabin, the sound of wagon wheels rattled over the ridge. Ezra groaned inwardly. More visitors. The Hendersons arrived first, their eyes scanning Clara up and down like she was some rare animal on display. Mrs. Henderson offered a stiff smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, Ezra," she said, her tone clipped, "seems you've found yourself quite a capable bride." Ezra flushed, unsure how to answer. Clara simply inclined her head, polite but distant. The Morrisons came next, bringing fresh bread as an excuse. Their sons stared openly at Clara, their whispers not nearly as quiet as they thought. Ezra wanted the ground to swallow him whole. By the time the sun dipped low, at least a dozen neighbors had stopped by, each pretending to offer welcome while stealing glances at Clara's long frame and strong hands. They asked questions they pretended were innocent. "Where did you learn to handle stock like that?" "Ever worked on a ranch before." "How long do you plan to stay?" Clara answered each one calmly, her voice level but Ezra could see the weight of it pressing on her. He hated that they looked at her like a curiosity, the same way they had always looked at him like a failure. As the last wagon rattled away, leaving dust in its wake, the yard finally fell quiet. Ezra stood on the porch, watching Clara brush dirt from her skirt. The evening sky burned orange, the first stars peeking out above the ridge. He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry," he said softly. Clara looked up, puzzled. For what? For all of it. The neighbors. The stairs. "You didn't deserve that." She leaned against the porch rail, her gaze thoughtful. "Neither did you." Ezra swallowed hard, caught off guard by the gentleness in her tone. For a long moment they stood in silence, the weight of the day heavy between them. Ezra wanted to say more, to ask her why she had stepped into danger for his sake, why she hadn't mocked him afterward like the others surely would have. But the words tangled in his throat. Instead, Clara broke the silence. "It's not what either of us expected, is it?" Ezra looked at her, then really looked at the strength etched in her shoulders, at the quiet weariness in her eyes, at the flicker of kindness he hadn't noticed before. "No," he admitted. "It isn't." And though the truth stung, it also held something else, something he wasn't ready to name. By the next morning, the story had outgrown the valley. It traveled on wagon wheels, slipped into conversations at the blacksmith's, and rode in the back of stagecoaches bound for Cheyenne. The woman who tamed a bull with her bare hands, they called her. Clara Blaine's name was on more lips than Ezra could count, and none of those lips belonged to people who truly knew her. Ezra tried to busy himself with chores, but it was no use. Neighbors arrived one after another, pretending they had errands near his place. Mrs. Hargrove brought a pie, though she had never baked for him in his life. She set it down on the porch with a smile too wide to be sincere. "Thought you might need a little sweetness after yesterday," she said, but her eyes never left Clara, who was stacking firewood by the cabin. By mid-afternoon, half the town had stopped by. The yard was crowded with wagons, the air buzzing with curiosity disguised as politeness. Men tipped their hats too eagerly. Women craned their necks, whispering behind gloved hands. Ezra's gut twisted. This wasn't neighborly kindness, it was spectacle. Clara, however, behaved as if none of it touched her. She wiped sweat from her brow and kept working, driving fence posts with powerful swings of the sledgehammer. Each strike rang out like a challenge. Her movements were steady, precise, unshowy, but undeniable. Samuel Carter arrived just as the sun was dipping. He was a broad man, thick in the chest, with the kind of grin that had always made Ezra's stomach tighten. His 3 sons followed like shadows, each one stronger and louder than the last. Carter leaned against a fence rail, pretending at casual interest, but his eyes gleamed. "Heard your ladies got away with stock," he drawled loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Could have used her when my own bull went wild last spring." Ezra stiffened. Carter's words weren't praise, they were a needle pricking at the sore he already carried. Around them, the crowd chuckled. Clara didn't look up from her work. She hefted another post and set it straight. "Your bull wouldn't have listened to me," she said, her voice calm even. "He'd have listened to you if you'd cared to understand him." Carter's grin faltered. His sons exchanged uneasy glances. The crowd shifted. Ezra's chest swelled with a flicker of pride, though it was quickly smothered by the old familiar ache of inadequacy. Clara was defending him again. Maybe she'd like some help with that post-hole digger Carter's eldest offered, stepping forward. He was 19, full of muscle, and the kind of confidence that came from never meeting a challenge he couldn't crush. He puffed out his chest and waited for Clara to hand over the tool. Clara finally paused. She lifted her head, sweat streaking down her temple, her expression calm but firm. "I've got my rhythm," she said evenly. "Best if you help Ezra with the wire." The boy's jaw clenched, his pride stung by the refusal. Behind him, the other 2 shifted awkwardly, uncertain whether to laugh or take offense. Carter's face darkened. Ezra bent quickly to the wire, pretending to work, though his hands trembled. He wanted to vanish to escape the scrutiny, but Clara's words lingered. She had chosen to deflect their attention to place him back into the center of the task. By the time the last wagon rolled away, the stars had begun to prick the sky. Ezra and Clara sat on the porch in silence. The air between them felt heavy, charged with unspoken truths. Ezra couldn't stand it anymore. He stared at the horizon, then finally said, "This isn't what you expected, is it?" Clara turned her head slowly. Her profile was sharp in the fading light, her eyes unreadable. No, she admitted. It isn't. His chest tightened. I thought, he stopped searching for words. I thought you'd be different, smaller, softer. Clara didn't flinch. Instead, she let the quiet hang until it became unbearable. Then she said, and I thought you'd be louder, taller, more certain. Ezra looked down at his hands, rough with calluses, yet trembling. So what does that mean for us? Clara's gaze softened, though her voice stayed steady. It means we're both standing on ground we didn't plan for. The question is, do we build something here or do we walk away? The night air thickened, filled with the hum of crickets and the weight of her challenge. Ezra had no answer. Not yet. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of whispers and stares. Ezra could feel the shift in every corner of the settlement. Wherever he went, the general store, the blacksmith's, even the church steps, conversation stopped when he entered. People weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking through him, past him, toward the towering shadow of the woman who had stepped into his life and his ranch. Clara Blaine had become a story. The woman who tamed a bull. The bride twice the rancher's size. The stranger who made Sloane look smaller than ever. Ezra tried to pretend it didn't matter, but inside it burned. He had always known he wasn't the strongest man, nor the most commanding. But now his lack was measured against Clara's overwhelming presence, and he came up short every time. The breaking point came one afternoon when Samuel Carter returned striding across Ezra's yard with the swagger of a man who believed the land belonged to him. His 3 sons trailed behind, smirking like they were heading into a show. Ezra felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. He wiped sweat from his brow and set down the bucket he'd been carrying. Carter leaned on the fence post, the same one Clara had set firm days earlier, and grinned. Well, Sloane, Carter said, his voice loud enough to carry, looks like you've finally got yourself a hand who can keep this place together. Shame it took a woman to do it. The words cut sharper than a knife. Ezra clenched his jaw, but his reply stuck in his throat. The Carter boys snickered, exchanging glances like schoolyard bullies. Clara was by the barn hauling hay bales with ease. She straightened, her eyes narrowing as she caught the tone of Carter's voice. Without breaking stride, she carried the bale across the yard and dropped it neatly in the corral. The dust rose around her boots as she turned calm and deliberate. I grew up on a ranch. She said, her voice even, but carrying a weight that made the air still. I know the work. It doesn't matter who does it so long as it gets done. Carter raised an eyebrow, his grin sharpening. That's so, then maybe Sloane ought to stay inside and let you handle the heavy lifting. Ezra's stomach churned. He wanted to shout, to push back, but shame pinned him silent. His worst fear spoken aloud in front of half the valley. Clara didn't rise to the bait. She dusted her hands on her skirt and looked Carter square in the eye. You measure worth by muscle, Samuel. I don't, and neither does Ezra. The words caught Ezra off guard. She had spoken his name with a steadiness that made it feel like a shield rather than a weakness. Still, the doubt gnawed at him. Did she really believe that? Or was she just trying to silence Carter? The eldest Carter boy stepped forward, then shoulders broad, his youth heavy with arrogance. You sure you don't need help with those posts? He asked, his tone dripping with mock chivalry. Be a shame if you tired yourself out. Clara tilted her head, studying him as if he were a colt testing boundaries. I appreciate the offer, she said, her voice calm, but I've got my rhythm. Best use that strength to help Ezra with the wire. He could use another set of hands. The boy froze, stung by the rejection. His pride faltered, but he forced a smirk to hide it. His brothers shifted uncomfortably. Even Carter himself blinked, surprised at her measured dismissal. Ezra felt the heat rise in his cheeks. Part of him wanted to crawl into the earth. Another part wanted to stand tall to claim the respect Clara had tried to hand back to him. But all he managed was a nod, his hands clumsy on the wire. The Carters left eventually, their laughter fading into the distance, but their words lingered like smoke after a fire. Ezra couldn't shake them. That evening, when the yard had grown quiet and the crickets sang, he sat on the porch staring at his boots. Clara sat opposite, her face lit faintly by the glow of the lantern. Finally he spoke. They're right. His voice was low, tight. Clara turned her head, her eyes steady. About what? That you're stronger than me. Better suited to this life. I stood there like a fool while you handled it all. His throat worked, but the words kept spilling. I'm not enough. Not for this ranch. Not for you. The silence that followed pressed hard, broken only by the night sounds. Clara didn't look away. She let his words hang raw and bare before answering. Do you know what I saw? She asked quietly. Ezra blinked uncertain. What when Samson broke through? You didn't run to Samuel Carter. You didn't call for stronger men. You came to me. You trusted me. That tells me more about you than muscle ever will. Her words landed like a stone dropped into deep water, sending ripples Ezra couldn't yet name. But as the night deepened and the lantern burned low, he realized something had shifted. Clara wasn't mocking him. She wasn't pitying him. She was telling him the truth as she saw it. And that truth was more complicated than his fears allowed. The porch creaked beneath their chairs, the night air carrying the faint scent of hay and wood smoke. Ezra stared at his hands, rough with calluses, trembling slightly from the day's labor and from the raw honesty that had slipped past his lips. He hadn't meant to bear so much, hadn't meant to confess the fear that had gnawed at him since Clara stepped off that wagon. But once spoken, the words couldn't be taken back. Clara sat across from him, her long frame half hidden in shadow, the glow from the lantern brushing her features in amber light. She didn't rush to fill the silence. She just sat steady and patient, her fingers drumming lightly against the armrest of her chair. Finally, she broke it. You think strength is measured in how much you can lift, how fast you can run, how loud you can shout. Her voice was calm even, but beneath it ran something heavier. That's not the kind of strength I came looking for. Ezra's head jerked up. Then what kind did you mean? Her gaze drifted toward the dark horizon. All my life, people saw me as a contest, a challenge. Men tried to best me. Women whispered behind my back. No one asked if I was tired of it. Her jaw tightened. I came here because your letters spoke of peace, of kindness, of someone who wanted to share life, not win against it. Ezra swallowed his throat dry. The weight of her words pressed into him. And what if I can't be what you hoped? Clara turned back to him, her eyes sharp but softened by something he hadn't expected understanding. Then at least we'll know the truth. Not the dream we wrote on paper, but the reality we stand in now. The air between them shifted. Ezra felt something loosen in his chest, though it was tangled with fear. He stood, abruptly pacing the length of the porch. His voice cracked as he said, I wanted to give you more. I carved a ring for you, spent 3 months shaping it, but it won't even fit your hand. Too small, just like me. From his pocket, he pulled a small wooden box. His fingers trembled as he opened it, revealing the simple oak band he had worked on every night by lamplight. The wood glowed faintly in the lantern's shine, polished smooth from hours of care. Clara leaned forward, her eyes fixed on it. She reached out carefully, her large hands dwarfing the delicate piece of wood. She slid it onto her finger only for it to stop at her second knuckle. Ezra winced, shame burning through him. But Clara didn't frown. She didn't sigh. Instead, she smiled a real smile, one that softened her entire face. 3 months, she whispered, turning the ring in the light. You spent 3 months making something for a woman you had never met, just out of hope. Ezra blinked, startled. You're not disappointed? Clara shook her head. It doesn't fit. But do you know what does? The care you put into it. That's worth more than gold. Ezra's chest tightened, his breath catching. For the first time since her arrival, he saw something new in her eyes. Not just strength, not just command, but warmth. She slipped the ring off and set it gently back into his palm. If it matters, I'd like us to resize it together. And while we're at it, I'll teach you what I know about stock, about horses. You teach me about wood, about the things that require patience. Her tone was firm, not pleading. These weren't conditions of doubt. They were invitations to build something together. Ezra stared at her words tangled in his throat. Finally, he managed, You'd want that with me? Clara leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. I wouldn't have come all this way if I didn't. The crickets sang louder, filling the silence that followed. Ezra sat again, his hands shaking not from fear this time, but from the unfamiliar flicker of hope. For the first time, he didn't see Clara as a stranger who had upended his life. He saw her as someone who had her own scars, her own burdens, and maybe, just maybe, those burdens could be carried side by side. Morning broke with a soft haze over the valley, the kind that made everything look washed in silver. Ezra rose early, but when he stepped outside, Clara was already at work. She stood by the barn sleeves rolled up, tying her hair back with a strip of cloth. In one hand she held a rope halter, in the other a bucket of feed. Ezra hesitated on the porch, watching her move with quiet certainty. Every gesture spoke of a life lived close to livestock, of long days and harder nights. For a moment he wondered if she even needed him at all, but then she looked up. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady, but not unkind. "Morning," Ezra answered, stepping down. He shoved his hands into his pockets, self-conscious. "You're up early." Her lips curved the faintest smile. "Cattle don't wait." "Neither should we." She handed him a second rope, her gaze meeting his. "You said you wanted to learn. Start by walking with me." The words carried no judgment, only invitation. Ezra nodded, falling into step beside her. They approached the corral where Samson stood, the massive bull watching them with dark, unreadable eyes. Ezra's stomach clenched, remembering the chaos of the garden, the way he had frozen while Clara walked straight into danger. Clara leaned against the fence, studying the animal. "He's not angry, Ezra. He's restless. A bull like him. You don't fight him. You listen. See how his ears flick. He's telling you something." Ezra frowned. "He looks like he's daring me to get close." Clara chuckled softly. "That's because you're looking at the horns. Look at the shoulders instead, the way he shifts his weight. That tells you if he's ready to charge or ready to stand." Ezra swallowed, forcing himself to look. Slowly he began to notice the small things, how Samson's pawing wasn't constant, how his breathing changed when the rope came into view. Clara explained each sign patiently, her voice low and instructive, never condescending. When she finally handed him the rope, Ezra's palms sweated. His fingers trembled as he looped it, but Clara stood close, her presence steadying him. "Breathe," she murmured. "He feels your nerves. Calm yourself, and he'll calm too." Ezra took a shaky breath, then another. The bull snorted but didn't move. Ezra slipped the rope where Clara showed him, tightening it with hands that steadied at last. To his astonishment, Samson followed when he tugged gently, lumbering toward the post without resistance. Ezra's heart soared. For once, he wasn't just standing on the sidelines watching Clara do what he couldn't. He was part of it. By mid-morning, they had worked through several tasks together, mending harness straps, checking hooves, repairing a latch. Clara moved with ease, but she never took over completely. Instead, she guided Ezra, letting him make mistakes and correct them, letting him feel the work in his bones. Later, under the shade of the porch, Clara examined the wooden ring again. She held it between her fingers, the oak polished smooth, but undeniably too small. "You said you carved this after my first letter," she said quietly. Ezra nodded, embarrassed. I thought your hands would be delicate." Clara didn't laugh. She didn't scold. Instead, she placed the ring back in his palm. "Then let's make it again. Together." Ezra blinked. "You'd want to—" Her eyes softened. "Rings can be resized, but what matters is that we shape it side by side. You'll teach me how to cut and sand, how to coax beauty from wood, and I'll teach you what I know about cattle. That's how a partnership should look." Ezra stared at her, his chest tightening with something he hadn't felt in years. Not pity, not judgment, but respect. That evening they sat together in the dim glow of the lantern. Ezra showed her how to hold the carving knife, guiding her large hands with his smaller ones. The moment was intimate, unspoken, but neither of them pulled away. The rhythm of blade against wood filled the silence, steady and patient. For the first time since she arrived, Ezra didn't feel like a spectator in his own life. He felt necessary. And though doubt still lingered in the shadows of his mind, a fragile hope had begun to take root. The valley sun rose hot the next day, burning off the morning haze and laying every imperfection bare. Ezra worked alongside Clara in the corral, sweat dripping from his brow as they reinforced the fence line with new braces. For once he wasn't trying to keep up with her pace, he was focused on the work itself. Claire's voice guided him with patient instruction, her steady presence keeping his doubts at bay. But outside the ranch, the whispers hadn't quieted. They had only grown louder. At the general store, Mrs. Henderson's sharp tongue painted Ezra as a man hiding behind his wife's shadow. At the blacksmith's men chuckled that Clara had more backbone than her husband-to-be. The story had twisted into something cruel, no longer awe at Clara's strength, but mockery of Ezra's lack. Ezra felt the sting when he overheard two farmhands muttering on the road. "Sloane's lucky she even looked at him," one said. "She doesn't need him. He's just there to keep her fed." He walked home with his head down, their words echoing like hammers in his skull. That evening, Clara noticed his silence. She had been sanding the new ring they'd begun, her hands deft despite their size. Ezra sat opposite her at the workbench, staring at the wood but seeing none of it. "What is it?" she asked finally. Ezra shook his head, his jaw tight. "Nothing." "Ezra?" She pressed her tone firm but gentle. He slammed the carving knife onto the table, startling them both. "It's everything," he blurted. "The whispers, the stares, the way they look at me like I'm less than a man, like you're the only reason this place even stands." His chest heaved, the words pouring out. "Maybe they're right." Claire's expression didn't waver. She set the ring down, folded her hands, and studied him with that calm, unwavering gaze. "Do you believe them?" Ezra froze. The question cut deeper than any insult. He wanted to deny it, but the truth pressed heavy on his tongue. Some days he whispered. For a long moment, Clara said nothing. Then she reached across the table, placing her large hand over his trembling one. "I've heard whispers my whole life," she said quietly. "Men saying I was too much. Women saying no one would ever want me. Children pointing in the street. But I stopped living by their voices a long time ago. I measure myself by what I build, by who I stand beside." Ezra stared at her hand, rough but steady against his own. "And what if I'm not enough to stand beside you?" Her eyes softened. "Then you let me stand beside you, and together we'll be enough." The words lingered, settling into the cracks of his self-doubt like mortar. Over the next days, their rhythm deepened. Clara taught him to read Samson's moods, to move with confidence rather than fear. Ezra, in turn, showed her how to shape wood into something lasting. They traded skills like vows, each lesson a thread binding them tighter. Neighbors came again, but the tone had shifted. Samuel Carter returned with his sons, less smug this time. He leaned on the fence, watching as Ezra guided Samson with a steady rope and calm voice. The bull followed without resistance, his massive frame docile under Ezra's quiet command. "Well, I'll be," Carter muttered, tipping his hat. Clara said nothing, but Ezra caught the faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. For once, he didn't feel small. He felt capable. That night, as the crickets sang, Ezra sat on the porch with Clara, the new ring lying between them. It wasn't finished, but it was theirs, shaped by both their hands. Ezra turned it slowly, the firelight glinting off the polished wood. "Maybe strength isn't just about muscle," he said softly. "Maybe it's about showing up, even when you're afraid." Clara leaned back, her voice steady. "That's the only kind of strength worth having." For the first time in years, Ezra believed it. The whispers might have dulled in town, but Ezra still carried them like burrs under his skin. Even as he worked beside Clara, learning the quiet power of patience with livestock and sharing the slow rhythm of carving wood, the old doubts gnawed at him. What if the neighbors were right? What if Clara deserved a man larger, louder, more commanding than he could ever be? One afternoon, while hitching Samson in the corral, Ezra overheard two men passing along the road. Their laughter carried like thorns in the breeze. "Look at that one," sneered. "She's teaching him like a boy. Sloane ain't fit to run a ranch without her," the other chuckled. "Maybe she should have placed the ad. She's the real rancher." Ezra's grip faltered on the rope. Samson huffed and shifted, sensing his handler's sudden unease. Clara, standing nearby, caught it instantly. She stepped in, steadying the bull with a soft murmur, her hand brushing Samson's thick neck. Ezra clenched his jaw, shame scorching his chest. He turned away before she could speak, before she could offer comfort that might feel like pity. That evening, storm clouds gathered over the valley. The air grew heavy, the kind of weight that pressed on a man's lungs. By nightfall, thunder rolled like cannon fire, and lightning split the sky. Ezra lay awake in his bed, staring at the rafters while the rain drummed against the roof. His thoughts turned like restless cattle. Too many voices, too many doubts. A sharp crack split the night. Ezra bolted upright. The sound had come from the barn. Without thinking, he grabbed his lantern and ran into the downpour. Wind lashed at him, rain soaking through his shirt in seconds. He flung open the barn door to find chaos. A beam had splintered under the storm's weight, crashing down across the stalls. Horses whinnied in terror, kicking at their enclosures. Samson bellowed, throwing his massive body against the pen. The structure shuddered on the verge of collapse. Ezra rushed forward, shoving at the beam, but it wouldn't budge. His muscles strained, his hands slick with rain and sweat, but the timber might as well have been iron. Samson slammed against the stall again, and Ezra stumbled, pinned for a breathless moment between the bull's weight and the fallen wood. Pain shot through his side, hot and sharp. Ezra Clara's voice cut through the storm. She appeared in the doorway, rain streaming off her like she was carved from the tempest itself. In 2 strides, she was beside him. With a roar that seemed to rise from her very bones, she heaved the beam up, muscles taut and trembling. Ezra dragged himself free, gasping as Clara bore the weight long enough to shove it aside. The barn groaned, then settled. The animals quieted under her steady voice. Her hand pressed to Samson's flank until the bull's breathing eased. Ezra leaned against the stall, clutching his ribs, his chest heaving. Clara turned to him, her face pale with fear beneath the lantern's flicker. "You could have been killed," she said, her voice shaking. "I had to try." Ezra rasped the pain, making each word sharp. Clara stepped closer, rain dripping from her hair, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed. "You think you're weak, Ezra, but weakness isn't running into a storm. Weakness is letting fear stop you, and you didn't." Ezra met her eyes, the storm outside, raging but silent compared to the pounding of his heart. He had never seen her look this way, terrified not of the bull, not of the storm, but of losing him. She reached out her large hand, brushing his cheek with surprising gentleness. "Don't you see? You don't have to be like Samuel Carter or any other man. You just have to be you. That's enough." Ezra's breath caught pain mingling with something deeper, something almost unbearable in its tenderness. For the first time since she stepped off that wagon, he saw Clara not as a force that overshadowed him, but as a woman carrying her own fears. And in that trembling moment, with thunder crashing overhead, Ezra realized they were both terrified of the same thing, being left alone. The storm lingered through the night, hammering rain against the roof until the land itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of water. By morning, the barn stood scarred but upright, the animals restless but unharmed. Ezra's ribs ached with every movement, but the sharp pain was a reminder of how close he had come to being crushed, and how Clara had saved him. She hovered that morning more than she meant to, her eyes flicking to him whenever he winced. Ezra caught her watching as he tried to carry buckets of water, his steps unsteady. "You shouldn't be lifting," she said finally. "I can manage," he muttered, though his breath hissed through his teeth when the weight pulled at his bruises. Clara stepped forward, taking the buckets from his hands as if they weighed nothing. "Stubborn fool," she said, but there was no sting in her voice, only fear still raw from the night before. Ezra lowered his gaze, ashamed. "You don't need me." "Not really. Last night proved it." Clara set the buckets down hard enough to slosh water onto the dirt. She turned to face him, her expression fierce. "Don't you dare say that." His head jerked up at the fire in her tone. "You think strength is in how much weight you can lift, how many storms you can stand through." Her voice cracked, not with anger, but with something deeper. "I've spent my whole life being told I was too much, too strong, too big, too strange. Men came to me to prove themselves not to see me, and every time I walked away more alone." Ezra swallowed, his chest aching with more than bruises. Clara's hands trembled as she spoke, though her voice stayed steady. "When that beam came down, I wasn't afraid of the storm. I wasn't afraid of Samson. I was afraid of losing you." The words hit him harder than the beam ever could. His breath caught his throat, tightening. "Clara." She shook her head, a wry smile flickering through the tears she tried to hold back. "Don't you see, you keep thinking you're the one who needs to measure up. But what I need, what I've always needed, is someone who won't run. Someone who'll still be there when the storm passes." Ezra felt something shift in his chest, a weight loosening, though it left him raw and unsteady. He stepped forward, his hand brushing hers small against her broad palm. "I didn't run," he said softly. Her eyes searched his face, and for the first time he saw vulnerability there, stripped of the armor she carried. "No," she whispered. "You didn't." The days that followed became a slow rebuilding. Ezra worked carefully, favoring his ribs, while Clara carried the heavier loads. But she never made him feel small. She asked his counsel on fence lines, let him show her how to plane the wood for the new ring. Their tasks became woven together, each relying on the other in ways that had nothing to do with muscle. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the valley, they sat at the porch table, the half-carved ring between them. Clara sanded the edges with deliberate strokes while Ezra traced patterns into the wood, showing her how to bring out the grain. "You know," she said quietly, "folks will keep talking. They'll say what they want. They always do." Ezra nodded, his jaw tight. "I know." She set down the sandpaper, meeting his gaze. "Then let's give them something worth talking about." His brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Her lips curved in the faintest smile. "A partnership. Not me overshadowing you, not you shrinking behind me. Us side by side. If the valley can't understand that, let them choke on their own whispers." Ezra stared at her, the fire in her eyes mirrored in his own chest. For so long he had measured himself against men like Samuel Carter, against the impossible weight of expectation. But Clara wasn't asking him to be bigger or stronger. She was asking him to be present, to be hers. He reached for the ring, his fingers brushing hers, and for once, his voice didn't tremble. "Then, let's finish this together." The storm had passed, but something stronger had taken root. And for the first time since her arrival, Ezra felt not like a man falling short, but like one standing exactly where he was meant to be. The valley glowed under clear skies again, but Ezra carried the storm inside him. His ribs still ached when he bent too quickly. But it was nothing compared to the gnawing question in his chest. Could he truly be the man Clara believed him to be? Life settled into a rhythm. Mornings began with Clara's long stride leading the way to the corral. She showed Ezra how to read Samson's moods, the twitch of an ear, the shift of weight in a hoof, the way the bull's eyes softened when patience met him instead of fear. Ezra learned slowly, fumbling at first, but each day his confidence grew. Afternoons belonged to Ezra. He brought Clara into the workshop, placing tools into her broad hands, guiding her fingers with his smaller ones. She was awkward with the carving knife at first, the blade nicking more wood than she intended. But Ezra smiled, steady and patient. "It's not about force," he told her one evening, his breath close to her ear as he guided her grip. "It's about care, about listening to the grain." Clara glanced at him, then her eyes catching his, and for a moment neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was charged. Still the outside world pressed in. At church on Sunday, Ezra felt the weight of stares. Whispers floated like smoke. She could break him in half. What does he give her? Strange pair, those two. Ezra kept his head bowed, his prayers muddled by shame. Clara stood tall beside him, her chin high, but later he saw the tightness in her jaw. She heard every word, too. That evening they sat on the porch, the night air cool. Ezra fidgeted with the unfinished ring, its edges smoother now, shaped by both their hands. The crickets sang, but neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Ezra broke the silence. "They're right," he said softly. "You deserve someone stronger, someone who won't make people stare." Clara turned slowly, her eyes narrowing. "Don't do that. Do what? Give their voices more weight than your own." Her tone sharpened, but beneath it lay hurt. "You think I don't hear them? You think I haven't heard whispers my whole life? Too tall, too broad, too much, always too much." She exhaled, her shoulders slumping. "I came here because I wanted someone who didn't measure me like that. Someone who might see me." Ezra's chest tightened. "And what if I can't be enough for you?" Clara leaned forward, her voice low, trembling at the edges. "Then at least don't make me carry this alone. I can lift Bull's Ezra, but I can't lift a marriage if the man standing beside me won't stand at all." The words struck him hard. He looked away ashamed, but her hand reached across the small space and covered his. Her touch was warm, steady. "I'm afraid, too," she admitted, her voice softening. "Afraid you'll wake up one morning and decide I'm not the woman you pictured, that you'll see me as a burden instead of a partner, that I'll end up alone again." Ezra's head snapped up, startled. "Clara." Her eyes glistened in the lantern light, though no tears fell. "You think I'm unshakable, but I've been shaken plenty. I just don't show it. Ezra swallowed the weight of her vulnerability pressing into him. Slowly, he turned his hand over, lacing his fingers with hers. His voice was hoarse but steady. Then let's be afraid together. And let's build something anyway. Claire's lips parted, and for the first time since her arrival, Ezra saw the hardness in her face soften completely. The ring lay between them on the table, unfinished but full of promise. They weren't just shaping wood anymore. They were shaping each other. And though the valley might never stop whispering, Ezra knew now that whispers couldn't undo what was growing between them, a strength neither of them had ever found alone. Summer deepened the grass on the hills, turning from green to gold. Life on the ranch moved in rhythms that felt for the first time less lonely. Ezra still rose before dawn, but now he found Clara already awake, her long frame bent over the corral fence, humming low as she watched the stock. They shared coffee on the porch in silence, not because they had nothing to say, but because the quiet no longer felt like emptiness. Yet beyond the ranch, the world still tested them. Whispers hadn't disappeared, they had only changed shape. The town no longer laughed outright. Instead, people watched. Ezra saw it in the way Mrs. Henderson's eyes followed Clara across the general store, or how the Carter boys paused when she walked by, suddenly unsure of themselves. Respect had begun to replace ridicule, but it came with its own weight. Everyone seemed to be waiting to see if the odd pairing of Ezra Sloan and Clara Blaine would endure, or if the cracks would split them apart. One afternoon, Samuel Carter strode into the yard again, his boots heavy against the dry earth. Ezra stiffened at the sight. Carter had a way of filling space, broad and booming, the kind of man Ezra had always felt himself shrinking beside. Clara stood at the corral driving fence posts with strong, deliberate swings of the sledgehammer. Sweat shone on her arms, each strike ringing like iron on stone. "Well now," Carter drawled, leaning on the fence rail. "Heard your bride's been teaching you tricks with the bull. Maybe she ought to run my place too." Ezra's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Clara paused mid-swing. She turned, wiping her brow, her gaze steady. "Samuel," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "This isn't about whose place is bigger or stronger. It's about whether the land is cared for. Ezra cares. That's why this ranch stands." The yard went still. Carter blinked, unused to being answered so directly. His sons shuffled behind him, their smirks faltering. Ezra's chest tightened, not with shame this time, but with pride. Clara hadn't spoken to defend herself. She had spoken to defend him. Carter muttered something under his breath and turned away, but Ezra caught the unease in his shoulders. The balance of power had shifted, if only a little. That evening, after the visitors had left and the yard had gone quiet again, Ezra sat on the porch beside Clara. The unfinished ring lay between them, gleaming faintly in the lantern light. "I don't know how you do it," he said softly. Clara glanced at him. "Do it, face men like Carter without flinching. Stand tall when they try to make you small." Her gaze softened, though her voice stayed steady. "Because I've been made small before, Ezra. I've been laughed at, challenged, pushed aside. It hurt every time. But I learned something." Ezra leaned closer, his breath caught. "What?" "That no one can make you small if you don't let them." She reached for the ring, turning it between her fingers. "And no one can make you enough if you don't believe you are." Ezra swallowed her words, sinking deep. For so long he had measured himself against other men's strength. But Clara was teaching him a new scale, one where worth wasn't measured in muscle, but in endurance and care and honesty. The crickets sang louder, filling the silence. Clara placed the ring back on the table, her fingers brushing his. "We'll finish this soon," she murmured. Ezra nodded, his chest warm. For the first time he believed that maybe they weren't just surviving whispers, they were outlasting them. And in the quiet of the porch beneath the endless stretch of stars, Ezra felt something shift inside him. Not the loud confidence of men like Carter, not the brittle pride of proving oneself, but a steadier strength built one small moment at a time beside the woman who had walked off a wagon and into his life. The weeks slipped by, hot and dry, the kind of summer that tested every rancher's grit. Grass grew brittle, water ran low, and tempers across the valley sharpened like blades. Ezra rose each morning with a knot in his stomach, half expecting Samson to test the fence again. The bull had become the measure of his courage, one misstep, one show of weakness, and the neighbors would say Sloan had gone back to hiding behind his bride. The test came one blistering afternoon. The air shimmered above the earth cicadas, droning like a choir. Ezra was mending a hinge on the barn door when a shout tore across the valley. He knew the sound instantly, Samson's bellow, wild and furious. Ezra's blood went cold. He sprinted to the corral, heart hammering, and found the bull loose again, horns lowered, charging across the open pasture. A group of children near the creek screamed and scattered. Men from nearby ranches rushed forward with ropes, but their panic only riled the beast more. Ezra froze at the fence, the old fear clawing at his chest. Call Clara, a voice in his head urged. She would know what to do, she always did. But another voice, quieter yet stronger, rose up inside him. No, not this time. Not only her. He grabbed a coil of rope from the fence post and vaulted over. Dust rose beneath his boots as he stepped into the open. Samson swung his massive head toward him, eyes blazing. Ezra's knees shook, but he forced himself still. Easy, boy, he said, his voice low, steady, echoing Clara's tone. You're not angry, you're just scared. Let's get you home. The bull pawed the ground, testing. Ezra's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. He could feel the stares of men on the ridge waiting for him to fail. He took a breath steady and deep and walked forward. Samson snorted, his massive chest heaving. Ezra lifted his rope, slowly looping it with trembling hands. When the bull lunged, Ezra shifted aside, just enough his rope flicking out and catching around the horn. The force nearly yanked him off his feet, but he dug in his heels, letting the rope play loose before tightening. The bull jerked, but Ezra didn't panic. He remembered Clara's words, "Don't fight him. Listen to him." He steadied his breath, pulled gently, then eased. Bit by bit, Samson slowed, confused by the calm instead of provoked by force. Ezra stepped closer, inch by inch, until his hand brushed the bull's neck. The animal shuddered, nostrils flaring, but then stilled, leaning into the touch, just as he had with Clara weeks before. Silence fell across the valley. Ezra slipped the rope halter into place, tying it with hands steadier than he'd ever known. Samson snorted once, then followed him back toward the corral like a chastened child. Dust clung to Ezra's sweat-soaked shirt. His ribs ached, but his back was straight. When he latched the gate, the crowd on the ridge erupted. Men whistled. Women clapped. Children cheered. Ezra's ears burned, but not with shame, with something that felt dangerously close to pride. Clara stood at the edge of the pasture, her eyes locked on him. She hadn't stepped in, though Ezra knew every fiber of her had wanted to. She gave him a small nod, slow and deliberate. Later, as the sun dipped low, she found him sitting on the porch steps, his rope coiled neatly beside him. She sank down next to him, her presence filling the space without crowding it. "You listened," she said simply. Ezra let out a shaky laugh. "I nearly lost my nerve." "But you didn't." Her hand brushed his, firm and warm. "You didn't need me this time." He turned to her, his chest tight. "I did need you. Not to step in, but to believe I could." For a moment, her face softened, the strength giving way to something gentler. She squeezed his hand. And in that quiet dusk, with the valley finally still, Ezra realized the whispers of the town no longer mattered. They could say what they wanted. He had faced the storm inside him, and for the first time he hadn't run. The next morning dawned cooler, the air crisp with the first hints of autumn. Ezra woke to the sound of an axe splitting wood. He stepped outside to see Clara in the yard, her broad frame steady as she brought the axe down in a smooth rhythm. Chips flew, the log split clean, and she stacked the pieces neatly by the porch. Ezra couldn't help but smile. Weeks ago, the sight would have filled him with shame, proof of what he couldn't do. But now he saw it differently. Clara's strength wasn't a threat to his manhood. It was a gift, one that combined with his patience and care made the ranch thrive. Morning, he called, his voice still gravelly with sleep. Clara looked up, brushing hair from her face. "Morning. Firewood won't stack itself." He chuckled, pulling on his boots. "Then we'd better finish together." They worked side by side, splitting and stacking until sweat dampened Ezra's shirt. Clara didn't take over. She matched his pace, handing him logs, letting him set the rhythm. For the first time, he felt not like he was being carried, but like he belonged in the labor. Later that afternoon, they returned to the workshop. The unfinished ring lay on the table between them, its grain smooth under the lantern light. Clara took up the carving knife, her hand steadied by Ezra's guidance. He showed her how to angle the blade, how to feel the resistance in the wood. Her brow furrowed with concentration, her movements awkward but determined. "You're rushing." Ezra murmured, his hand brushing hers to slow the motion. Clara smirked faintly. "I'm used to forcing things to yield." "Wood doesn't work that way," Ezra said. "It listens if you do." She looked at him, then her eyes holding his longer than before. "Maybe people are the same." Ezra's chest tightened, his breath catching. For a moment, the world outside, the whispers, the doubts, the gossip faded into silence. There was only the two of them, the slow rhythm of knife on wood and the quiet hum of something neither dared to name aloud. Days passed, each one weaving them closer. Clara taught Ezra how to rope with confidence, how to move with calm authority around the cattle. He wasn't strong like her, but he learned balance timing, patience, and soon the animals responded to him. Ezra in turn taught Clara how to polish the ring, how to plane boards for the barn, how to sand until the grain shone. Their lessons became excuses to stay near, to share space, to laugh when mistakes came. One evening as they stood by the corral, Samuel Carter arrived again, his swagger muted this time. His sons lingered behind him, their eyes darting between Clara and Ezra with something that looked less like mockery and more like respect. Carter cleared his throat. "Heard you handled that bull yourself, Sloan. Folks in town been talking." Ezra straightened, though his pulse raced. "I did what needed doing." Carter studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Not bad. Not bad at all." He tipped his hat toward Clara. "Seems you two make quite a team." Clara said nothing, but her hand brushed Ezra's arm lightly, a small acknowledgement that the tide had turned. As the Carters left, Ezra exhaled relief and pride mingling in his chest. Clara turned to him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "You stood tall today," she said simply. Ezra's throat tightened. "Because you were beside me." She smiled, then a real smile that reached her eyes. That night, as the stars spread across the sky, Ezra placed the nearly finished ring in Clara's palm. "When this is done," he said quietly, "I'd like you to wear it. Not because I asked for a bride in the paper, but because I want you." Clara studied him, her eyes shimmering in the lantern glow. "Then finish it with me," she said, "and I'll wear it." In that moment, the whispers of the valley no longer mattered. What mattered was the partnership they were forging, steady, patient, unshakable. Autumn crept in, slow and sure, the hills brushed with amber, and the evenings cool enough to warrant a fire. Ezra and Clara settled into a rhythm that felt almost like belonging. Their days were full, but not lonely. Ezra noticed the change, most in the evenings when the porch no longer echoed with silence, but with the sound of shared voices, soft laughter, and the scrape of wood as they worked together on the ring. The valley, too, began to shift. Men who once smirked now tipped their hats with respect. Women who had whispered behind gloved hands brought small gifts of bread or preserves excuses to linger near the ranch. Even Samuel Carter, broad and blustery, walked onto Ezra's land with less swagger than before. His sons hung back eyes, curious rather than mocking. Carter cleared his throat as he leaned on the fence, watching Ezra move calmly among the cattle. "Got to admit, Sloan," he said, his tone reluctant but genuine, "you surprised me. Thought you'd let her do all the work. But you've learned." Ezra adjusted the rope in his hands, keeping his voice even. "I had a good teacher." Clara stood at the gate arms, folded, her expression unreadable, but her eyes glinting with pride. Carter glanced at her, then back at Ezra. For the first time, he didn't look like a man ready to sneer. He looked like a man measuring something new. His eldest son stepped forward, voice cautious. "Miss Blaine, could you show me how you calm that bullpaw's stock gets riled sometimes? I've never seen anything like what you did." The question hung in the air. Weeks ago it would have been delivered with a smirk meant to embarrass, but now the boy's tone held respect. Clara studied him for a long moment before nodding. "I'll show you, but only if you listen." The boy flushed, nodding quickly. His brothers leaned forward, eager, their bravado gone. Ezra watched the exchange with quiet astonishment. The same family that once mocked him now sought their guidance. Something in the valley was changing. That evening, after the Carters left, Ezra and Clara sat at the workbench, finishing the ring. Clara polished the oak until it gleamed, her hands careful where they had once been clumsy. Ezra fitted the band, sanding the edges smooth. When they set it down between them, complete at last, a hush fell over the room. It's beautiful, Clara murmured, running her thumb over the grain. Ezra swallowed his chest tight. Because we made it together. She looked at him, then really looked, and for a moment the strength in her eyes softened into something warmer, something that made Ezra's breath catch. Do you realize, she said quietly, how far we've come since that wagon stopped in your yard? Ezra chuckled, though his throat felt thick. I thought the world ended that day, and I thought I'd made a mistake stepping off. Her lips curved faintly. Maybe we were both wrong. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full of promise of questions unspoken of something growing that neither of them could deny anymore. That night, Ezra lay awake staring at the rafters. The ring sat on the table beside his bed, gleaming faintly in the lantern's last light. He thought of Claire's hand slipping into his large but steady, of the way her voice softened when she spoke of being alone, of the strength she carried not just in her shoulders, but in her heart. For the first time, Ezra didn't wonder if he was enough. He wondered if he could live up to the gift of what she was offering, partnership, respect, and maybe if he was brave enough, love. Outside, the autumn wind stirred through the valley, carrying the whispers of the past away with it. The future for once felt wide open. The first frost came early that year, glittering across the fields like a sheet of glass. Ezra woke to see Clara already outside, her breath fogging in the dawn air as she broke the ice on the water troughs with a hammer. The sight made him pause in the doorway, this woman strong and unyielding, yet standing on his land, on their land. 6 months earlier, he had been alone, the silence of the ranch suffocating him. Now that silence had been replaced with her steady presence, filling spaces he hadn't realized were empty. Preparations for the wedding began almost without them. Word had spread in town, and neighbors who once whispered now asked when the vows would be spoken. Mrs. Henderson offered fabric for a dress her earlier scorn replaced with brisk enthusiasm. The blacksmith's wife brought bolts of ribbon. Even Samuel Carter, in his own gruff way, volunteered a wagon to bring folks in from the valley. Ezra felt strange in the middle of it all. He had imagined a quiet ceremony, maybe only a witness or two. But Clara seemed untroubled by the growing interest. If they want to come, she said one evening as they sat at the workbench finishing a second band, let them. We've weathered their whispers. Let them see the truth with their own eyes. Ezra studied her, then the firelight glinting off her hair, her broad hands polishing the wooden ring until it shone. He realized she wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. She simply wanted to stand in front of the world as who she was and as who they were together. The day of the wedding dawned clear and cold, the church bell ringing across the valley. Ezra stood at the front of the small wooden church, his palms slick, the unfinished years of doubt pressing at the edges of his mind. But when the door opened and Clara stepped inside, all of it fell away. She wore a simple dress, nothing adorned, but the way she carried herself made the room hush. She walked with the same long stride she had taken when she faced Samson, but her eyes were softer now, fixed on Ezra alone. When she reached him, he took her hand, his smaller fingers swallowed in her strong grip, and he didn't feel small at all. The preacher cleared his throat and began, but Ezra hardly heard the words. His heart thundered as he slid the resized oak ring onto Clara's finger. She slipped a second ring into his hand, a matching band she had carved herself, the wood dark and smooth, a mirror of his devotion. Gasps rippled through the congregation, not mockery this time, but awe. Samuel Carter sat stiff in the back pew, his hat in his hands. For the first time, Ezra saw no smirk, only respect in the man's eyes. When the vows were spoken, they weren't the usual words of tradition. Ezra's voice shook as he said, I don't promise to be strong in all the ways the world measures. I promise to stand beside you, to care when care is needed, to learn when I don't know how, and to never run from the storms. Clara's reply came steady, low, but certain. I don't promise to be small or soft. I promise to meet you as I am, to share what I know, to bear what you can't, and to let you bear what I can't, to build a life not of roles, but of truth. The preacher's voice trembled slightly as he declared them joined. Applause rose, not the polite kind, but something warmer, fuller. For the first time since the wagon rolled into Ezra's yard, the community wasn't staring at a spectacle. They were witnessing a partnership. Later, as the church emptied and neighbors pressed their congratulations, Ezra and Clara stood together at the doorway. She squeezed his hand, her lips brushing close to his ear. Still think you're not enough. Ezra smiled, the doubt that once haunted him fading like mist under the morning sun. Not anymore. And when Clara leaned down, her forehead resting against his, Ezra felt the truth settle deep inside him. He had found the partner he hadn't dared to hope for. Winter set in crisp and sharp, the valley draped in white. The ranch that had once felt too big for one man now thrummed with the rhythm of two. Smoke curled from the chimney wood neatly stacked high by the porch, the corrals reinforced with solid braces that would hold against any storm. Samson stood calmer these days, his calves grazing safely within the fence. Ezra walked the line of the pasture one morning, the snow crunching under his boots. He paused to take it in, the land, the quiet, the sense that it no longer pressed heavy on his shoulders. Clara joined him, her stride long, a scarf wrapped around her neck. She carried a bucket of feed with ease, setting it down without strain. 6 months ago, he would have felt dwarfed by her strength. Now he saw it differently. Her strength didn't diminish him, it steadied him. And his patience, his care with every detail had steadied her. Together they had taken a modest homestead and turned it into something thriving. At supper that evening, Clara held out her hand, the oak ring gleaming on her finger. It sat snug now, properly sized, carved by both their hands. Ezra's matching band caught the firelight as he reached across the table. "Do you ever think," Ezra asked quietly, "how close we came to missing this?" Clara smiled, her eyes soft in the glow. "Every day. And every day I'm glad we didn't." The neighbors who once whispered now sought their counsel. Men asked Ezra how he had steadied Samson. Women asked Clara how she kept her composure when storms rolled in. The ranchers who had once mocked now tipped their hats with respect. Even Samuel Carter, once the loudest critic, had stopped sneering. When he crossed paths with Ezra in town, he only nodded, his voice gruff, but even, "You've done well, Sloane." Ezra carried those words home, not as validation, but as proof of how far he and Clara had come. Respect hadn't been handed to them. It had been built plank by plank, fence by fence, promise by promise. That night, as the wind howled outside, Ezra and Clara sat together by the fire. Clara leaned back, her arm brushing his, her presence warm and steady. Ezra looked at her, really looked, and felt a quiet awe. "I thought I wanted someone delicate," he murmured, "but what I really needed was someone strong enough to meet me where I was weak and kind enough to let me do the same for her." Clara's lips curved and she squeezed his hand. "That's what partnership is. Not one making the other small, but both making each other whole." Ezra leaned into her, the firelight painting the room in gold. Outside, the snow fell heavier, but inside the cabin it felt like spring had already arrived. The loner rancher had waited for a mail-order bride. What he received was not the fragile dream he once imagined, but the partner who had changed everything. Together they were more than either had ever been alone. And for the first time in his life, Ezra Sloane knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Your thoughts will help us create meaningful stories. And if you want to hear more powerful healing stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the bell icon so you don't miss any new episodes. And most importantly, share this video with people who need a little hope today. Thank you so much for your time. We hear you, we listen to you, and we are honored to tell these stories for you.